Welcome back to A Localized Journey, the series where we take a long, hard look at the localization of various games across time. It's hard to believe it's been over a year now since I started this series, and we're still talking about Pokémon Red, but I guess that goes to show just how many localization changes there are to talk about here. Either way though, we are starting to get down to the wire with this game. We've just got a few cities left, but before we can move on, we do of course have some unfinished business here in Fuchsia City. Last time we left off just as we completed the Safari game, which means our next stop would be to deliver the teeth to the warden of the Safari Zone, but seeing as the conversation we have there is translated relatively well, we're just going to move right along to Koga's gym. The first trainer we encounter inside is a man who says in Japanese, "I, who was once a magician, looked up to ninja, so I joined Fuchsia Gym." This was localized to, "I wanted to become a ninja, so I joined this gym." This is yet another case of lost detail for the English game, which really shouldn't come as any surprise at this point in the series. Over here in the West, we completely lost the idea that this trainer was a magician at one point, which is nothing but a negative for the overall level of detail and world building of the game. I've gone over this a million times by now, so I'll be brief, but stuff like this adds up at the end of the day, and more often than not, if you follow this trend of localization, you end up with a kneecapped game that never reaches its full potential. That's precisely why I point stuff like this out. Changing things up a bit now, we run into a new trainer type in the Fuchsia City gym, and that trainer type is known as Tamer in English. The Japanese name for Tamer is Moljutsukai, or literally Wild Beast User or Wild Beast Tamer. In my opinion, Tamer here isn't a bad translation, it just once again removes some of the detail present in the original name. Even something like Beast Tamer or Beast User would have been much better, but I guess maybe referring to Pokemon as beasts wouldn't be the best idea for the game, and Game Freak may have agreed with this, because the Tamer trainer type hasn't appeared outside of Gen 1 and its remakes. Complete side note here, but something interesting about the Tamer trainer class is that they hold a whip and a lollipop. This is a reference to the Japanese idea of ame to muchi, or the candy and the whip. This phrase has various uses, but it can be used in the context of different types of training, like animal training for example. The idea being that at times you have to be strict, aka be the whip, and sometimes you have to be nice, aka be the candy. The idea is often equated to the Western carrot and the stick, and I'm assuming you can see why. Okay, next up we come across a gym trainer who says in the original Japanese, "Oh, hold up, how do you like Fuchsia Gym's specialty, the invisible wall system?" This was localized to, "Stop right there. Our invisible walls have you frustrated?" Now, as you may have noticed, there are two main changes to this dialogue in English. The first change is the removal of the so-called Fuchsia Gym specialty. Personally, I think this gave the dialogue some nice flavor, so it's a shame it was removed. Moving on, the second change to this dialogue was not a case of removal, but rather addition. The end of the English dialogue has this trainer ask if we were frustrated by the invisible walls, but this was not present whatsoever in the Japanese. The trainer simply asks how we like the invisible walls. Now, obviously, there's an implication here that the walls would be annoying because that's their purpose, but it is not explicitly stated here. Like I always say, as a localizer, you should just stick to what's actually written in the text. That way, you're covered in scenarios like this where you can't be 100% sure what the implication is. The next gym trainer we come across has original dialogue that goes, "The gym leader here, Kyo, is a descendant of the Iga ninja. Hey, what are you a descendant of?" This was altered in English to read as, "Master Koga comes from a long line of ninjas. What did you descend from?" The most obvious and most egregious change here is of course the removal of the direct reference to the Iga ninja. If you didn't know, Iga Ryu or Iga style ninjutsu is one of the most famous styles of ninjutsu from Japanese history. It originated in the Iga region of Japan in the Kamakura period, or around 1185 to 1333 AD, as a form of guerrilla warfare, and grew more unified and formalized from there. Now, Iga Ryu is not to be confused with another major school of ninjutsu that was around at the same time, known as Koga Ryu, which is sometimes referred to as Koga ninjutsu in the West. As you may have guessed, this Koga Ryu ninjutsu is where Koga gets his English localized name, which in the context of him being an Iga ninja actually makes no sense. Another thing that makes no sense is the removal of the reference to the Iga ninja in this dialogue, if a reference to the Koga that wasn't in the original was okay. what makes one okay but not the other. As you probably know by now, I'm a very strong advocate for consistency in localization. In my opinion, the absolute least a localizer can do is be consistent in their work, not only because inconsistent localization can cause many different types of problems, but most of all because I believe at the bare minimum the audience deserves a consistent localization. The worst feeling to me as a player when playing a localized game is not knowing what was changed and to what degree it was changed. But at least I have the luxury of checking the original game if I think something may be off with the localization. English-only players, on the other hand, which make up the bulk of the audience, have no recourse other than to simply hope that the localizer didn't just randomly decide to change a bunch of important details for no reason. The audience is putting their faith in you to deliver a localization that is consistent and doesn't stray too far from the original, so in my opinion, the right thing to do as a localizer is to do your best not to betray that trust. As we've seen here and many times before though, that's sadly not always how things go. Okay, moving on. A juggler we face in the Fuchsia gym has lost dialogue that goes, "You're pretty good," in Japanese. Now, for whatever reason, this was changed to "dropped my balls" in English. I don't know if this was supposed to be some kind of sneaky little innuendo by the localizer or what, but either way, it clearly has gone way beyond anything that I would consider an appropriate localization for the original statement. I guess the localizer just had another one of those uncontrollable urges to add his own flair to the dialogue and completely ruin the connection between the two games. Seems he gets a lot of those urges, doesn't it? Might want to get that checked out. Now for the last gym trainer before Koga, we have another juggler who had his pre-battle dialogue and lost quote changed. Starting off with the pre-battle dialogue in Japanese, it reads, "Thoroughly taste my Pokemon's strange moves." The English version here is, "Let's see you beat my special techniques." Personally, I don't think this is the worst localization we've seen, but once again, the direction of the sentence has been changed. In the Japanese, the juggler is commanding you or telling you to taste his moves, while in the English, he's implying that you should try to beat his moves. Like I said, not an enormous deal, but still a change that was made. Moving on to the lost quote, this one is much worse. In Japanese, the quote goes, "I see. Are you also a move user?" And in English, it's, "You had me fooled." So yeah, basically unrecognizable from the original. Not really much to say here, they're just two completely different sentences with zero through line whatsoever. Moving on to Koga's pre-battle dialogue now, the original Japanese reads as, "Fa fa fa. It pains me to think a mere child would challenge me to a battle. If you're hit with poison, you'll self-destruct. If you fall asleep, you can't resist. Taste the pinnacle of shinobi technique." The English version of this interaction is, "Fwa ha ha ha. A mere child like you dares to challenge me. Very well, I shall show you true terror as a ninja master. You shall feel the despair of poison and sleep techniques." So honestly, this isn't the worst gym leader dialogue localization we've seen thus far, but it does of course still have its problems. The main issue here is definitely the way the localizer completely rewrote Koga's talk on poison and sleep. The original is very clear in describing what will happen to you if you take his poison and sleep techniques head on, but in the localization, it's just said that we'll despair at them. As we've seen many times before, this is an example of removed detail, as well as a dampening of a specific character's uniqueness and personality. An unfortunate result of this, and other such changes to Koga's dialogue, is that he comes off much more robotic and bland like many of the other characters we've encountered on our journey so far. And just like with those characters, it really is a shame to see. Koga's post-battle dialogue is translated much more accurately than his intro dialogue, but that may just be based on the simple nature of the text here. There is, however, one slight change made to the part where Koga explains what the TM he gave us contains. In Japanese, he says, "Inside TM-06, a Pokemon technique that's been passed down in my household for 400 years, secret technique Toxic is sealed." This dialogue was once again dumbed down in the English version of the game to be, "TM-06 contains Toxic. It is a secret technique over 400 years old." Koga's household, the passing down of the technique, the idea that the technique is specifically sealed in the TM, Koga's family of ninja going back 400 years, all of this is missing from the English game, and it was all removed just by simply changing 2 sentences of dialogue. If this isn't a perfect example of how a small change can greatly affect a localization, then I don't know what is. But anyway, it's finally time we move away from Fuchsia City and start making our way towards Cinnabar Island. There are a few ways to get to Cinnabar Island, as you may know, but the path I've chosen to take this time around is to surf south and then west from Fuchsia City, as it is the closest and most straightforward option. As we begin our long maritime journey, we encounter a swimmer who has had his dialogue altered ever so slightly in the English game. In Japanese, he says, "When I'm looking at the blue sea, I forget all the bad stuff." And in English, he says, "I look at the sea to forget." This is yet another example of detail that's been lost in translation, with the English localization having removed the color of the sea and the specific things that this swimmer forgets when he's looking at the sea. Now personally, I don't think this is the worst example of lost detail we've seen in Pokemon Red, because the main idea of the sentence is mostly intact. Does that excuse the removal? Absolutely not, but things definitely could have been a lot worse here. Following this first swimmer, we come across two more swimmers who have both had their lost dialogue altered in English. The first swimmer says, "That's a bad way to lose" in Japanese, and "ooh, traumatic" in English. The second swimmer, on the other hand, says "aryarya" in Japanese, which is basically an exclamation of disappointment or surprise. This was changed to simply "glub" in English, and I'm not entirely sure what it's supposed to mean here. My best guess would be maybe a sound of drowning or sinking underwater, but I really have no idea. Clearly these two localizations have gone too far, as they've essentially completely veered off the path that is the original Japanese text. There's just absolutely no defending these changes in my mind. Now for a bit of a change of pace, let's talk about our first new Pokemon in a while. We come across a trainer who has a Sea King in their possession, and I believe this is our first encounter with one. In Japanese, Sea King is known as Azuma-O. This comes from two sources: a specific type of goldfish known as the Azuma Nishiki, and O meaning king. So the king part here is pretty much unchanged, which is nice, but as for the rest, well, not so much. The Japanese name is extremely specific on what this Pokemon is based on, but the English chose to change that specificity to the broadest of broad words for a water Pokemon, sea. Once again, off the top of my head, something like Gold King would have been fine, or even Azuma King if you wanted to go the more direct route. As far as I can see it, there really was no good reason to not go with a name that was much closer to the original here, which is always a very sad realization. Next, we cross paths with yet another swimmer who says in Japanese, "You there, boy. This ocean is dangerous." The English localization of this pre-battle text is "These waters are dangerous." So obviously the main alteration here was the removal of the entire first sentence, which at a glance you may not think of as a big deal. However, if you consider the meanings here, there is a bit of a problem with this localization. In the original Japanese, the fact that the swimmer calls out to our young lad of a protagonist before stating that the ocean is dangerous implies that he is telling us that we shouldn't be here. The implied meaning is that this ocean is too dangerous for a young boy like ourselves. The English localization, however, completely erases this implication, making it sound like the swimmer is just stating the fact that the ocean is dangerous. As a result of this, we have a much more bland interaction, and we've even lost some detail as well. Not a great localization, in my opinion. Now, as you've probably noticed, we've been interacting with a group of 4 swimmers here, and this is something that's brought up in the dialogue of the bottom swimmer. In Japanese, he says, "We all swam this far together, but I'm beat." The English version of this is, "I swam here, but I'm tired." So, we've effectively removed the only mention of this group of 4 swimmers being friends, and just made an overall really boring sentence. All you had to do was change the I to a we, and the localization would have been so much better. I just can't get my head around why this was changed, and honestly, I don't think I want to either. The next trainer we come across says, "It's shallow for a ways out here, so there's lots of people swimming," in Japanese. The English localization of this is, "The water is shallow here." Where's here in this context? Specifically in this area we're in now? The whole ocean? The distance from the shore to here? We have no way of knowing in the English. The Japanese here uses the phrase toasa ni natteru, meaning to be shallow for a ways out or to be a shoal. This paints a specific picture in the mind of the reader, while the English leaves almost everything up to your imagination. In addition to this blunder, we also completely lost the part about there being a lot of people swimming here because it's a shallow area, which just adds insult to injury. You definitely hate to see it. Next up, we have another new Pokemon to talk about, and that Pokemon is Cloister. In Japanese, Cloister is known as Paru Shen. This comes from the transliterations of pearl or paru and shell or sheru. The name Cloister comes from clam and oyster, as well as cloister as in to shelter. It's clear that there really is no connection between the two names here, which sadly seems to be par for the course when it comes to Pokemon Red. A little ways to the west of the trainer with the Cloister, we come across the Seafoam Islands. In Japanese, these Seafoam Islands are called Futagojima. This just literally means Twin Island. Now, you might be thinking, what about the possibility that the name could mean Twin Islands, making it more in line with the English? Well, in this case, the Japanese word for island, or shima, is used, and in most cases that word is used to describe a singular landmass. There are many other Japanese words that could have been used here that refer to a group of islands like Gunto, Retto, or Shoto, but the developers specifically chose to use shima. Also, if you take a look at the Twin Island from further away, it's pretty clear that this is just a singular island. So as to why this was changed to the plural islands, I have absolutely no clue. Just outside of the entrance to Twin Island, we find a trainer who says in Japanese, "Floating on the waves, I am a fish." This was localized into English as, "I love floating with the fishes." The entire point of the sentence has been changed here. In Japanese, this girl is pretending to be or trying to become a fish, while in English, she just likes floating with them. There was no need to alter anything here. It was a perfectly normal sentence for a Pokemon game, and yet it was changed. As a result, the English version of the game lost another interesting interaction and gained a boring one. Not a fair trade-off, in my opinion. The loss here is even further exacerbated by the altering of this girl's post-battle dialogue as well. In Japanese, she says, "Ooh, mambo." This is a pun on mambo, the dance style, and mambo meaning sunfish in Japanese. The English version of this is just youch. So yeah, absolutely no effort was put into preserving the reference to a fish, thus ruining the continuity of this character's dialogue. You could have made any fish pun you wanted here. I know this localizer loves to add his own flair to the dialogue, so why is it that at a time like this that actually calls for some localizer flair, we just got a basic exclamation like youch? This was your time to shine and you gave it up. I just don't get it. Then again, maybe he figured he had his fill of adding flair to the game because he added it in so many places it didn't belong already. As you may already know, there are no trainers inside of the Seafoam Islands. The only thing we run into that's new is one of the legendary birds, Articuno. Now, I'm not really planning on going back to catch Moltres or Zapdos, so I figured I'd talk about all three birds together, and now seems like a good time to do just that. The names all follow a similar pattern, so it should be easy to follow. In Japanese, Articuno is called Furiza, which is a transliteration of freezer. Zapdos is called Sanda, which is a transliteration of thunder. And Moltres is called Faya, which is of course a transliteration of fire. Now, obviously, it wouldn't be a great idea to just have a Pokemon called Fire or Thunder in English because they're just very basic English words, but I don't think the names had to be changed that much to be usable here. In fact, I think Freezer or even just Frieza would be fine for Articuno. From there, all you really had to do was make the names for the other two birds more in line with Articuno's name and you'd be all good. If you're wondering what those names would look like, maybe you could do something like Thunda with an A and Faya, F-A-I-Y-A. This way, the names stay mostly intact and they're changed from just being basic words. It's probably not a perfect solution, but it's decent enough, I think. And now for the last change we're going to be talking about in this episode, we come across a swimmer who says in Japanese, "Cinnabar Island to the west is a Pokemon research island. My dad works there too." The English localization of this is Cinnabar in the west has a lab for Pokemon. So once again, we've definitely lost a lot of detail here and even had some change in detail as well. Rather than the island being a Pokemon research island, it just has a lab. Those are two very different things that paint two completely different pictures in the player's mind. I personally really like the idea that Cinnabar is an entire island devoted to Pokemon research. It gives the island more lore and helps the player form their own idea of what it would look like in their head if it really existed. On the other hand, if Cinnabar just had a lab, then we really don't gain much insight into the island as a whole. All we know is that somewhere on the island, there exists a lab. Woohoo! So much world building. As for the blatant removal of this kid's father working on Cinnabar Island, we all know that's a massive net negative. We lose detail about this trainer, we lose further detail about the island, and we have even possibly completely removed a character from the game. All of that just lost because the localizer had to take out what amounts to 5 small words. I really don't know what you could have done to localize this any worse, outside of just completely rewriting the dialogue. It's just absolutely baffling. And with that, we have made it to Cinnabar Island, where our journey will continue in part 11. Like I said in the beginning of the video, we are really coming down to the wire here with this series, so it's probably only going to be another few episodes or so, and that'll be that. But I guess that's probably getting a bit too far ahead of myself. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this episode, and if you did, consider giving the video a like, and maybe subbing if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out.